Welcome to this webinar of the Effective Statistician, where we will talk about storytelling with data, learnings from COVID-19 data visualizations. Flattening the curve, this is probably one of the most prominent data visualizations that we had since a very, very long time. It's something that influenced politicians, journalists, decision makers, everybody in our society around the world in a huge extent. And it really helped us to align behind a common concept to fight COVID-19. And this diagram, which actually is not showing real data, but sketching some data, helped really to convey the message what is happening here. And this diagram itself has some interesting history. At the beginning, it was just showing these two curves without mitigation and with mitigation. And then only later, the healthcare capacity was added as a reference line. And that helped to convey the message much clearly. Then there was a lot of other additions, like here in this example, where the healthcare capacity is slightly increasing to respond to the COVID-19 crisis and be able to better meet the needs of the patients. And so this curve is an example of how data visualization can have a big influence on all of us. Now, why is visualization so important? Visualization of data makes something in our brain that tables cannot. It helps to offload internal cognition and memory to the part of the brain that acts very, very fast. It also means that there's less cognitive burden for the audience, so that people can understand things very, very fast. Just as an example, if you have a table and there's 3, 4, 5 numbers in it, it's really difficult to see what is the biggest number, what is the smallest number. But if you see a corresponding bar chart, you directly see what is the longest bar. You don't need to think about it. You don't need to sort things. It's directly clear. Also, it's possible to show vast amount of details around the data. If you can just think about a scatter plot with lots of these different dots in there, that's pretty much impossible to do in a table or in a listing, where you don't see what's happening. But with a scatter plot, you very, very easily see what's happening. You can understand distributions very, very fast. If you think about dashboard type of visualization, these help you to actually interact with the data. So that's a really, really nice way to dive into the data, understand more about the data, and take some lessons from this data instead of just having a blank screen and that's what you have. Or if you have a lot of tables, it's much better to use an interactive dashboard than to have a huge pile of tables to understand data. There's generally two different ways you can think about visualization. On the one hand, there is explanatory visualizations, and on the other, there is exploratory visualizations. And these have a lot of things in common, but they also have a couple of things that are different. First, if you think about explanatory visualization. Explanatory visualization is something where you want to communicate a message, where you want to say, okay, this is what we found in the data, and you want to help others act on it. The exploratory way of thinking about visualizations is like with this Johns Hopkins dashboard, where you want to understand data, where you want to dive deeper into data. And these different things have very different setups. However, some of the underlying visualization principles they have actually in common. So let's talk a little bit about this famous John Hopkins dashboard. Lots of people around the world use it, and it was developed very, very early in the pandemic. So there's a couple of things in there that were actually customized more for this early start and probably could be updated now. And actually, they have been updated. There's a couple of things for this dashboard, how it evolved over time. And that's also a nice thing. When you have actually these kind of dashboards, you can learn how people use it. You can learn what kind of data is in there. You can learn how to better display the data. And that is just an example of the iterative nature of how visualizations evolve. Just with the flatten the curve concept diagram, that also evolved over time as people were understanding how they better can get the message across. And the same is with the John Hopkins dashboard. So the first thing, if you want to create a dashboard, is you need to think about how people read actually a visualization. And in the Western culture, where people read from left to right, people start at the top left, then go to the top right, then go to the bottom left, then to the bottom right. And that's how naturally people will consume the information in a dashboard or in any other visualization. That's why the first and most important things are at the top left. Very often the title is there, things like that. Here in the dashboard, for example, there's the overall number of confirmed cases for COVID-19 around the world. It's the oldest snapshot here, so it's of course now many more people affected. Then on the top right, you see the death rate overall and the number of patients that recovered. Then you go to the bottom left and you see kind of, okay, there's all these different countries there, and there's also the overall number of countries that are affected. And only the last part of that is where you can see the curve in terms of how these things develop over time. Now, very prominently here in the middle, there is this big map of the world where you can see the spread of the disease over the world. And only on the top right, bottom right, you see the evolution over time. Now, that's a prioritization of what was important for the developers of this dashboard. But how does it look like for others? This is not the only dashboards that we have. There's a lot of country-specific dashboards as well. So let's have a look, for example, in the one that is used in France instead. It has actually lots of things in common with the John Hopkins dashboard, for example, the overall design with a black background, and the use of color is also very, very interesting. But they have a much more different prioritization. It's much more prominent, kind of the evolution over time, because for these developers, that was more important, and less important was the spread within the country. Now, with this probably more cleaner data source in France, they have also the opportunity to display some other data in there. For example, things like age distribution, which is probably much more difficult if you have many, many different data sources around the world, like for the John Hopkins one. You see that also for a couple of other more national specific dashboards. They have usually more homogeneous form of how they collect data, and therefore are able to display the data in a different way because they have more complete information and more kind of standardized data set. The use of color is actually one of the most important things you can think about when you create a visualization. It's really unfortunate if you're kind of forced to only use black and white, because color is something that directly attracts attention, and it also creates emotion in the audience. So, for example, red shows danger. There's something important going on here. And you can also make sure that with red, you have the different parts of the data connected. So wherever, for example, you see here something about confirmed cases, you see first the red number confirmed cases. Then you see the red dots on the overall map also shows you the distribution of the confirmed cases. And then you have the numbers in front of the countries, again in red, to show you these are confirmed cases by country. There's some other colors used here as well. And there's, for example, this gray color at the bottom left, and this red color, yellow color on the right side. Unfortunately, this should actually also be red, because it's also about confirmed cases. And it's not directly clear, because of the different use of color, that this is about the same statistics. Here, green is used to show something positive, the number of recovered cases. Green and red are very often contrast to show something like good and bad. Unfortunately, for colorblind people, that's not optimal. So sometimes it may be more advisable to use, for example, red and blue to show something that is good, something that is bad. The use of color is something that it might be really difficult for less artistic people like myself, for example. But fortunately, there are some good tools for it. So the first tool that I want to show you is this color brewer. Very easy to find, colorbrewer2.org, where you can choose color palettes and give all kind of different examples of colors that work good together. Also different color schemes in terms of sequential colors, or colors that are more good for diverging things, you know, from very good to very bad, so kind of give you a range. These type of different things. And directly, you can also make sure that things are good for colorblind people, which is actually quite prevalent in the population, especially for men. Another nice tool is these Adobe tools. Adobe Color, the Adobe Color wheel that you find on the internet, and the Adobe Capture that you can get as a smartphone application. Both are really nice tools to create various panels, and you get the hex codes for these different things so that you can transfer the exact colors into your software like PowerPoint or R or whatever you use for creating visualizations. Adobe Capture is something that is based on images. So basically you can just, you know, use an image that you shoot with your iPhone and then get the same color from these images so that you get a similar look and feel in terms of the colors. So for example, you want to take something that feels really natural and you take a color from your garden. Or you want to have something that looks kind of more cold and you take something that is maybe from an industrial zone. Or maybe you want to have something, you know, that feels like a sunshine and you take, you know, the sunset or something like this, and then you get these warm red, yellow colors from it. But then always you get a nice contrast and you can try out different things with it. And if you look into my homepage, The Effective Statistician, I used or created this color scheme actually with this Adobe Color wheel. If you want to highlight specific numbers or statistics, you can actually use them as itself as visualizations. Something that we very often don't naturally think about, To use the numbers itself, we, in terms of visualization, we directly think about bar charts, line charts, and things like that. But having numbers in there is sometimes really important, especially if you want to convey these really important numbers, like here, overall number of confirmed cases, overall number of deaths, overall number of affected countries. When you have a dashboard, there's a couple of interesting things you can do with it in terms of interactivity. And the first thing is filtering. So here you can, for example, click on Germany, and then you see, okay, what are only the German cases in terms of total confirmed, a number of deaths, and how is in Germany the evolution over time looking like. However, there's also sometimes problems with it, especially if you have dirty data. So here you can see the number of confirmed cases on the top, showing the number of confirmed cases in Germany, and in this line next to Germany is not the same. Probably there's some missing cases. Maybe, there's some confirmed cases that are not associated to a country and therefore are added to Germany at the top, but not at the lower end. Could be. But there could be many, many different reasons for it. So if you have dirty data, or if you have lots of different data sets that you get updated over time, it's quite nice to check your dashboard for all kind of different sets of data to make sure it's robust and the visualization still works. If you use a dashboard, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be intuitive of how to act with it. Also, it's quite helpful to have a little bit of background information there in terms of details, how you get to the data, maybe a contact person who to contact if something goes wrong, or if you need some help with the dashboard. There's lots of different things that should come together with the dashboard, and that's in the annotation. So the annotation of the Johns Hopkins dashboard actually evolved quite a lot over time. At the beginning, it was much more kind of just the legal aspects in it, but now there's more and more information in it. The German dashboard from the Robert Koch Institute directly had in mind, okay, we are communicating here to a layman audience, so we need to be very specific and detailed in terms of all the different things that we explain here, because you can't assume that everybody directly understands what is displayed here. So that is quite nice if you create these annotations in such a form that it's easy to get, and then you also reduce the overall trainings that may be associated with rolling out a dashboard. Using maps is actually an interesting thing. Whenever we have some geographical data in our data sets, we are very often tempted to use maps. Now, maps is sometimes actually not the best way to display the data. It's good if you want to kind of see how really the distribution is across some space. So for example, here, the world or within Germany, and you're really interested in the correlation across the country or across the world. But if you actually just want to show kind of data by certain areas, it might be actually better to have some kind of a bar chart or something like this, because then you can sort it and arrange it according to what is important for you. And you're not restricted to this, this visual cue of the map, because it also comes with a couple of different limitations. If you have a map, the only thing that you can actually really do with it is color-coded. And color is not optimal for showing, for example, differences. We'll get into that a little bit more. When you want to show distributions, be sure that you have a good approach with it. So if we, for example, look here in the John Hopkins ones, I'm, to be honest, not sure why there are so different denominators. So for example, for Russia, you see, let me just get the pointer here. For Russia, you see there's just 1 point here. And then for the US, there's many, many points, also for Canada. Then again, for Brazil, there's just 1 point. And in Europe, you can't really see what are all these different points because they're overlaid so much by each other. So I'm not sure that this is the best way to actually show that. So you can get, at the beginning where there were not so many cases, it was good because there were also only some dots here and there, and you could still make some sense out of that. But now, as there's so many big dots here, it's really hard to, get the overall message. Whereas here on the right-hand side, with Germany, these are standardized in terms of the populations there. And therefore, you can very easily see that, most of the cases are in the southern part of Germany. The more you go to the northeast, the more rare the events are. And that is also adjusted for the density of the population. So you don't get just the density that is actually shown, but you really get the density of the population that is really shown, but you really get a better understanding of the distribution of the disease. Sometimes it's actually quite funny to think about the dashboards and the tables, because sometimes there's not a kind of strict line between these. So here's, for example, something that looks very much like an interactive table with visualization. So you have this table where you see all the different countries, and you see the different affected cases. And the speed of the disease development is shown with these colors to give an impression of where we are in this curve. And the nice thing is you can interact with the table just by sorting it. And that gives you, oops, that was too fast. That gives you, different ways to look into the data and actually interact with the data. Interestingly, if you sort for these different things, there's some very often things coming up here. If you sort, if you have lots of different groups with hugely variables in sample sizes, and you sort and rank these, then very often you see the small ones at the top and at the bottom, and the bigger ones in the middle. Well, for statisticians, that is clear that you have that because, the variability gets more extreme with the small numbers and less extreme with the big numbers. And so it's the maximum and minimum you usually have with these smaller groups. That's not so clear with a layman's audience. They directly see, oh, why are all these kind of small countries here at the top? They must have really, really bad COVID-19 management. No, probably because they're just small. And that's why they rank better than the bigger ones. Another way to show this data and to display actually this distribution over time in a better way than just having these bands with the color is having these multiple graphs. With multiple graphs, you can have, for example, here very, very nicely all these different lines for the different countries where you see the development. And then you have the lines there for the expected death rate, and then you have the lines that is the actual death rate. And then the difference between these lines is color-coded here in terms of the COVID-19 cases that are actually attributed to COVID-19 and that are not attributed to COVID-19. Now you can see some interesting things, like for example here. There's an excess in death rates that is not attributed to COVID-19, at least officially. But of course you can think like, in this country there's probably an underreporting in terms of COVID-19 cases. And that is maybe different here, where there's only a very, very small difference, or here, very, very small difference in terms of the expected versus the expected, the actual minus the COVID-19 cases. So this gives you a much better, nice view of the actual evolution, because if you have something like this quantitative position, so line is much better to see kind of what is the effect than color. So color is nice to show, especially kind of to highlight something and things like that, but it's not great to explain actually sizes of effects. If you have these multiple graphs, one thing you need to look into are the axes. So what is really nice is all the horizontal axes are aligned, so you can see, okay, when did the pandemic start in these areas? But the vertical axes, they are actually not aligned. And that helps to, of course, compare vastly different regions with very different sizes in terms of the population. And so that you can actually compare the bigger ones with the smaller ones in a reasonable way. We talked now a couple of different of these examples. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the underlying principles here. There's a couple of different Gestalt principles, and I want to highlight 4 important ones here. The first one is proximity. If you put things close to each other, they belong to each other. Think about, for example, a scatter plot. The points in a scatter plot that are more closer to each other are more similar to each other. Points that are more far away from each other have much more bigger differences in terms of their values. Also, if you, for example, want to have a label next to the bar in a bar chart, then directly, because you have put it next to it, it's directly clear these belong together. You don't need additional connections there. Similarity is something that we can use quite powerful to showcase that things belong to each other. For example, we have seen that with the Johns Hopkins dashboard. Same color, the red for the confirmed cases, and therefore we directly know these belong together. It's also quite nice if you, for example, have a title and you want to say a number of confirmed cases over time, and you make confirmed cases, you make that in red, then directly you have a label for everything that is red in your visualization. Another very, very easy tool to actually get rid of some of the legends. Enclosure, it's maybe not optimal to see here, but these 4 dots here are actually, there's a box in the background around it. That helps you also to put things together. Yeah, so if you, for example, have multiple graphs, you put boxes around these, then that shows directly that these belong together, or you can group them in boxes. So let's say everything that belongs to Europe, all the different countries, you box them together, and then you maybe have the Asian countries together, another box around that, and therefore you can show which actually belongs together. The connection is a very, very obvious one that you can use, and the most prevalent cases are there, of course, the line graphs that we very often see. All the dots in the line are connected, and therefore you know what belongs together. And you also get a sense of the distribution over time. But it's also used in other settings. For example, if you think about these spider diagrams, yeah, there are also the different dots connected to each other. Also, they don't really have a meaning. It just helps you to see what belongs together and get an overall feeling for the area that's covered. You can also use it, for example, to connect labels to something. So sometimes it's difficult to put the label directly next to the corresponding part in the visualization. Then you can just put a little line next to it, and that helps to connect these different things. There's a couple of other Gestalt principles, but for today, let's don't dive too deep into that. As I just talked about color, there's actually one color that is really, really nice and completely underestimated, and that is gray. Gray is a great color to actually put things into perspective, to add additional information, but not distract from the main part that you want to show. So for example, here we have the death rate over time, and we have that for the couple of different years, and also then for 2020. And 2020 is highlighted and in red, very, very nicely, prominently. Red is the #1 color that you probably use to showcase something. Here's something big, important, urgent, dangerous. And all the other years are put in gray into the background. And that helps you to put this red line into perspective. For example, for other flu seasons, for other years. And that is something that is really nice to use if you have lots of different information. So for example, if you want to have lots of different treatments displayed in a graph, and you're only interested in one or maybe two, then you can highlight these 2 treatments in the graph, put everything else in the background. Yeah. Or if you want to highlight, don't know, the different teams' performance within a soccer league or football league across the season, and you have all these different lines in there, 20 different lines. If you color code all of them, you don't see anything anymore, but maybe you can color code only your favorite team, or maybe your favorite team and your most hated team or whatever, and put them next to each other. And therefore you see all the other teams still in gray in the background as references, but the teams that are really of interest are in the foreground. That is also used here in the next slide. But what I really want to talk about first is the title. If you have especially if you have explanatory visualization, a really, really important point is the title. As statisticians, we are very often tempted to use non-informative descriptive titles, like number of intensive care beds by country, or something like this. But journalists know that it's much better to emphasize the key takeaway. So for example, here in this German newspaper, they wanted to show that Germany looks good compared to other countries. And so they put it into the title. And the title, this chart shows the number of intensive care beds for every 100,000 people. Of course, there's always something, weird with these things, because depending on the selection of the different countries, you can come up with various different outcomes. I'm pretty sure there's a couple of countries that have more intensive care beds than Germany, but they were not included here. And then there's a couple of others that are included here that are worse. I'm always a little bit spurious regarding these type of graphs. But again, here the use of color is used to drive focus. And so you see Germany at the top, and that is highlighted because that is the title is about Germany. Another nice thing is they used a horizontal bar chart. First, it's actually quite nice to distinguish lengths that way. But secondly, and probably more importantly here, it's really nice to have long labels. If you, for example, have long labels from adverse events or from long co-medications or long treatments or things like that, and you want to kind of cram them under the vertical bars, there's not a lot of space there. And then, for example, Excel puts an angle on that, and you need to look like this to read them. Not very nice. It's much better in these cases to use the horizontal bar charts instead of the vertical ones. If you think about this graph for a moment, what actually makes it so good? The surprising truth is what makes it really impactful and easy to read is not so much about what is there, but what's not. And that's what I speak to in this slide. There's no legend in here. It gets without a legend because you already have the numbers in the chart. So you don't need to have another horizontal axis here. Also, the title and the subtitle is so informative that you don't need anything else. Well, they have the source here as well, but that's maybe not a legend, just another annotation. They also don't have grid lines, which you very, very often see in visualizations produced by Excel, because Excel puts it nearly always into it. Yeah. Simplification is something that is really, really important. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's a really nice book called Storytelling with Data, and from the respective homepage, I took this example. It showcased 2 times the same visualization, the same data, but one on the left-hand side is before, and on the right-hand side is after decluttering it. So taking away all these things that distract you, for example, the grid lines, the 3D effect, the weird way of showing the descriptions below the bars, the many, very, very crowded numbers on the vertical axis. Completely got rid of the vertical axis, like in the journalist approach that we have just seen. Have a much nicer font in there and use color much more intentionally to drive the focus on the left side and drive the focus on to the women, because the title says more women start their holiday shopping early. So it drives focus there. And here you can see also a couple of these Gestalt principles that I talked about earlier. So for example, similarity. In the legend there at the top, women are color-coded. The font itself is color-coded. And therefore it's directly obvious that these pink bars are for women. It's probably even obvious because you directly have this annotation with blue and pink, which is maybe a little bit stereotypically, but well, we have that. My daughter surely wears more pinks than my sons do, so as a parent, I probably have that. The other thing is, for example, the Gestalt principle in terms of proximity. The labels are directly within the bars. So we don't need another description. Oh yeah, this label belongs to this bar. It's obvious. Also, in terms of sorting, it's directly clear that from left to right it's earlier to later. Lots of conventions are used here to make it easy to read. I want to now go back to another example of the COVID-19. And this is a combination of numbers and multiple graphs. So it looks a little bit like a table, and it looks with these small multiples, but it's arranged in such a form that it's really, really easy to see and connect with. Here's also color is used to show the gradient, to show how fast the speed is, how fast the time it takes to double the confirmed cases. It's connected here with the color in terms of the number and the color around it. And red is pretty predominantly used here. This table also comes with a really, really nice annotation, so you can interact with it quite nicely. And you have here lots of different actual nice use of gray and shadings of red. And therefore you see different levels, so to say, in terms of this graphic. What's really important, and then, the less red, the more shaded red is going first in the background, and then there's the black, and then there's more gray and even more gray. These different areas here where you have different layers, so to say, of importance. Now let's go to a second part of visualization principles, and that is pre-attentive attributes. Pre-attentive attributes also speak directly to the fast thinking part of your brain. If we think about Daniel Kahneman and we have fast thinking and slow thinking, that these pre-attentive attributes we directly get. So we can use orientation, we can use length, we can use width, we can use size, shape, curvature, added marks, enclosure, and all these other things, and especially color again. Color makes things stand out. If you think about a big car park and it's full of gray and blue and dark cars, and there's this red beetle in the middle, well, the owner of the red beetle probably never searches for its cars because it jumps out. And the same is true with the red color. Now, these different pre-attentive attributes are not equal in terms of their importance for different variables. If you want to have, if you have categorical variables, then it's really good to use color to point out the different categories. It's not so good if you have more quantitative variables. Then, of course, things like length, position, even orientation are more important. Yeah, if you see a line graph and the line shows you the slope, that's kind of orientation, and you can see, okay, this is fast, this is not so fast if the slope is not so steep. The length and the width is really nice that is used in bar charts to showcase quantitative variables. And as we have seen, for example, with the maps, with the color, it's not so easy to differentiate in terms of quantitative differences. If you have two shadings of blue, you can't really tell how much that is. You can't just tell this is more and this is less. But putting really kind of differences to it, it's much easier, for example, with length. Now, if you develop a visualization, what is the first thing that you need to think about? I do a lot of trainings on visualizations, and there's something really interesting I do in these trainings. I trick the audience. So I give them a data set and tell them, visualize this data set. I speak a little bit about what is the data and what is the telling and what are the different variables and things like that. And I ask them, oh, if you need any further information, just ask me. And very rarely someone asks for the vital details that you need to know to get the visualization right. I want to speak now to these vital details. The first thing is you need to be clear who you are communicating to. Who's the audience? Is that your study team? Is that a layman's audience? Is that the executive committee in your organization? Are these specialists? Do they know about the data? All these kind of different things help you understand to visualize the data. If you think, for example, these different plots that we have seen, some of these come, let's say, from the New York Times. And the New York Times has probably a very, very good feeling for who's reading the New York Times. And then there's other of these things that are more for, a very general audience. So they need to be usually much more simple. Something that you put on a TV that is broadcasted to everybody needs to usually be more, simple than in a, high quality, probably targeting more educated people. Newspaper. The next thing that you really need to know about, especially in terms of explanatory visualizations, is what do you want to communicate? What is the key message? And you need to be really crisp here to get something right. Just show me the data is not really a good way to come up with a good visualization. Also, things like, tell me the efficacy of this drug is also not specific enough. You want to have something like, for drug A, for this endpoint, show me how this compares to drug B in this time period and show me that it's much faster onset or whatever. Yeah, so be really, really specific about the message. If you design dashboards, it's not so much about the message, it's more about what are the questions that the user will have. What are the specific different questions that you want to help the user answer with this dashboard? Write them down. Write them down for the different users that you will have and make sure that you then design your dashboard so that these questions get answered very, very easily. And there will then also be a prioritization about it. Those questions that you prioritize will, predominantly shape the dashboard. And necessarily, then also that you deprioritize will be more harder to answer with the dashboard. There's always a trade-off in visualizations. What do you want to emphasize more? Like we have seen with the different dashboards in, for example, the Johns Hopkins one versus the French one. They had different answers, different questions that they prioritized. For example, for the French one, it was more important to show the evolution over time and less important to show the spread over the area. So these are things that help you design your dashboard so they are optimal for these specific questions. And just always remember there is not something like a permanent dashboard. The next thing you need to think about when you develop your dashboard or your visualization is clarity in terms of how. How will the visualization be interacted with? Will there be a presenter that talks to it? Then you probably don't need so many annotations, so many different legends and things like this, because the presenter can speak to that and explain it. Or does it need to be completely standalone? Will they interact with it on a smartphone, in a conference room, or on a desktop? These things play a role. When you develop dashboards or visualizations, always think about this as a very, very iterative process. And all the visualizations experts I have talked to have one tip in common. Start with pen and paper. Don't directly go into your software, whether it's R, SAS, PowerPoint, Excel, whatsoever. Start with a visualization using pen and paper. Do lots of these. Iterate through them very, very quickly, so you can discard lots of, the bad ideas and come up to something good. While you're actually creating these, you will see, oh, this is not, a detail that I haven't thought about. And then you can, fine tune these more and more. It's much more easier to discard something that you have worked just 5 minutes on than to discard something that you invested 2 hours of programming in. Also, it makes, that way you can very, very fastly interact with others and show, is that something that you want to see? Or is that something you want to see? And you get a very, very fast improvement cycle. The other thing is the expertise that you need to have. So today I showed you a couple of different design principles, but there's actually a vast amount of research about visualization and a lot of different books. So, this slide just shows you lots of different books and podcasts and homepages that you can use. I want to highlight a couple of these. So first is storytelling with data. I talked about that earlier. Cole, Nussbaum, and Affleck wrote these really, really nice books. The white one is an introductory book. It tells you all the backgrounds, the theory, and really actionable steps. And the Let's Practice one is kind of a workbook. It gives you worked examples, but also it gives you content that you can use to train others on visualizations. The big book of dashboards has lots of different examples in it for lots of different use cases, and then goes through these different use cases, and by the way, explains what makes a great visual dashboard. There's so many details that you can take care of, like hovering over something, how you arrange your dashboard. Yeah, actually, when you want to start creating a dashboard, start with post-it notes, and put the different things that you want to display next to each other, and then you can rearrange them and say, how should I best structure it? Do I have, the filters at the top because everybody will, use them because they first need to set the filters to have the relevant information of them? Or is the filter not so important and more kind of an afterthought for most of the people? So you can maybe put them to the side or to the bottom. So they're less important, de-emphasized, but still there to interact and dive deeper into the data. Then we have the Wonderful Wednesdays. The Wonderful Wednesday is an initiative of the special interest group about visualization that is specific for any of the visualizations in the healthcare industry. So if you think about adverse events, how they are displayed over time, if you want to have lots of different subgroups for treatments, if you think about Kaplan-Meier curves and all these kind of specific problems that we have in this part, then this is a really, really great resource because it helps you to, the format is actually that you have a webinar every month, second Wednesday of the month, that's why it's Wednesdays, and say you get presented a case study. Then the community can actually work on visualizations of this case study, of the data sets, and give, then provide back their visualizations to the special interest group. And they will review then all of these visualizations in the next webinar. And so through this feedback algorithm, there's a lot of learning. And so also these webinars are recorded, and you can head over to the PSI group, site at psiweb.org, and under video on demand you find these recordings. For statisticians, what is also really important is to show uncertainty, distributions, error rates, precision. And therefore, the MU Collective with Jessica Hullman and others is a really, really great resource because it shows a couple of different ways how you can show uncertainty, and they do a lot of research in terms of what is the best way to show uncertainty.